I heard her before I saw her. It wasn't crying. It wasn't begging. It was the voice of someone backed into a corner who still refused to bend her spine, even as the whole crowd tried to shove her down. That afternoon I was carrying a basket of fresh forged nails and 2 repaired scythe blades through Ravenmill Market to deliver to old Farmer Galdrick. My name is Cale Thorne. I'm the blacksmith who lives at the very end of West Lane, where the road turns to gravel and the old lumber mill rots quietly by the stream. I earn my bread with hammer fire and calloused hands, shoeing horses, mending hinges, sharpening plow blades, anything the town needs that it can't make itself. I'm not rich, but I eat every day. In a place like Ravenmill, that already counts as luck. I meant to walk straight past Baron Cole's general store. Crowds in the market usually mean trouble, and trouble usually means someone else's problem. But then I heard Baron's voice roar over the noise. "Kneel down and open your bag. Don't think I didn't see you hide it." I stopped. Through a gap between 2 farmers' shoulders, I caught sight of her. She was an orc woman, but not the towering, battle-scarred kind the border guards like to scare children with. She was lean, almost slight, for her kind shoulders narrower than most orc women I'd seen. Her gray cloak was cheap and threadbare at the hem. Black hair tied low at the nape of her neck, strands loose from the wind. In her arms, she held a woven basket that contained nothing more than a dark loaf of bread, a bunch of yellow turnips, and 2 small onions. She wasn't kneeling. Even though 2 of Baron's hired hands stood on either side of her like they were ready to force her down, she kept her back straight and her chin slightly lifted. That was what made the shopkeeper lose his mind. "I told you," he bellowed, face-purple belly nearly touching the counter. "Your kind loitering around here never brings anything good." The orc woman looked him dead in the eye. "I took nothing from you," she said. Her voice was hoarse with exhaustion but steady. "You may search my basket, my sleeves, my person if you want to humiliate yourself in front of the whole market, but I am not a thief." A few people in the crowd snickered, others whispered. I hated that whisper. It was the dull knife every town kept sharpened for people who had no one to stand behind them. Baron snatched the basket from her hands and upended it across the counter. The loaf tumbled to the dirt. Turnips and onions scattered. A small cloth-wrapped bundle slipped from the corner of her cloak. He snatched it like he'd just caught the crime of the century and ripped it open. Inside was half a bar of the cheapest soap the store sold. There he roared. Petty theft, exactly what He threw it into her basket. I didn't realize I had spoken until every head turned. The air in front of the store went still. Baron glared at me like he smelled smoke in his hayloft. "What did you just say, blacksmith?" I stepped forward, set my own heavy basket of nails and scythes down beside the porch post, and walked straight into the open space between him and the orc woman. For the first time, she turned her head toward me. Not grateful, not pleading, just looking as if she couldn't understand why anyone would step into this mess. "I said he threw that piece of soap into her basket," I answered. I was standing across the lane long enough to see it. I hadn't been there that long, but I knew Baron's type. He'd short-weighed grain before blamed children for stolen eggs, cut sugar from widows' portions, and then called them ungrateful. If he could turn a lone stranger into a thief in front of a crowd, he would do it without blinking. "You filthy liar," he snarled. "You dare accuse me?" I moved until I stood directly beside the orc woman. She shifted her weight a fraction as though making sure I wouldn't suddenly step away. "If you're so sure you're right," I said, voice loud enough for the whole circle to hear, "then call the town guard. Let them search her basket, check your ledger, question every person who stood here. But if you're only trying to shame a woman who has no one to speak for her, then today you picked the wrong man to do it in front of." The crowd quieted. The orc woman said nothing, but I could feel every muscle in her body pulled tight as a bowstring. Baron looked at me, then at her, then at the faces around the square. He was calculating not right or wrong, but whether this was still worth the trouble. Finally he spat, "Get off my property. Both of you." I crouched, picked up the fallen loaf, the turnips, and the onions, and placed them back into her basket. When I held it out to her, her fingers hesitated for half a second before she took it. At that moment, I still didn't know her name. I only knew I had just stepped between a mob and a stranger they had chosen as their scapegoat for the afternoon. And I knew from that single heartbeat onward that I had already been pulled into her life, whether I wanted it or not. She walked away fast after we left Baron's store basket clutched tight against her chest like a shield, too fast for someone whose right leg was dragging just a little with every step. I noticed it right away, the slight hitch, the way she favored her left side without wanting anyone to see. The crowd had already started to scatter, but a few eyes still followed us down the lane. "Wait," I called. She stopped, but didn't turn fully, only half glancing over her shoulder. The wind tugged at the frayed edge of her cloak. "You've done enough," she said. Her voice was flat-tired, the kind that had learned long ago how to close doors before anyone else could slam them. "I don't need you following me for thanks." "I'm not following for thanks," I answered, catching up but keeping 2 paces between us. "I just want to make sure Baron doesn't send one of his thugs after you once the crowd's gone." She finally turned. Her eyes were amber pale and weary with faint shadows underneath that spoke of too many nights without real sleep. She studied me like she was trying to decide if I was another kind of trouble. "You often step into strangers' messes like this." "Not usually." Today my mood was bad. For the first time the corner of her mouth twitched almost a smile, but she killed it before it could form. I held out my hand. "I'm Cale." She was quiet long enough that I thought she wouldn't answer. Then quietly, "Lyra. Lyra." I repeated, letting the name settle in my head, the way hot iron settles into a mold. The market was closing up around us. Canvas awnings snapped down, vendors shouted last calls. The air had turned colder, carrying the smell of coming rain. I looked at her basket again. Bread, turnips, 2 onions. Not enough for tomorrow, let alone the rest of the week. "Where do you live?" I asked. "Behind the old tannery." I knew the place. A row of half-collapsed sheds by the drainage ditch where the ones who couldn't afford real rooms crawled in at night and got chased out like stray dogs when the owner remembered. In this season the nights bit hard. I glanced at her leg again. "You're hurt. Not your concern." "You're very good at saying that. Because people ask about my business too often." That shut me up for a second. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the last silver coin I'd been saving for decent salt next week. I held it out. She jerked her hand back as if I'd offered her a live coal. "No, I'm not giving it for free. Think of it as you owing me 1 meal later." "I don't borrow." "Then don't call it borrowing. Call it payment for standing straighter in that square than most men there ever could." Lyra stared at the coin like it weighed more than her whole basket. She shook her head once sharply. Then after a long breath she took it. But she didn't pocket it right away. She closed her fist around it so tight her knuckles paled. "Why did Baron pick you?" I asked as we started walking again. "Because it was easy," she answered without hesitation. "Because I have no one. Because I buy little, speak little, and belong to no one in this town." Belong to no one. I heard the weight in those words. Ravenmill ran on circles, family circles, guild circles, debt circles. Anyone outside every circle became easy to shove aside. I walked her all the way to the alley behind the tannery. It was worse than I remembered. Rotting wood, leaking roofs, the stink of old hides and sewage rising from the ditch. Lyra stopped at the most sheltered corner where someone had strung a scrap of canvas as a windbreak. She turned to face me. "This is far enough." I looked at the miserable spot she called home. Then at the coin still clenched in her fist. Then at the way her right foot kept shifting to ease the weight. "You have a fever?" I asked. "Are you a healer now? I'm a blacksmith." "Means I can tell when metal's about to snap." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, except it was too tired to be one. "I don't need pity." "Good. I don't have much to spare." This time the almost smile reached her eyes for half a heartbeat before it died. I turned to leave. I made it maybe 20 paces down the alley before the feeling hit me again, that same heavy feeling I'd had in the square. If I walked away now tonight, would be worse for her than the afternoon crowd. I stopped, turned back. Lyra was still standing exactly where I'd left her small against the sagging wall, looking far more alone than she had when the whole market was staring at her. I asked the question I hadn't planned to ask. "You want dinner?" She looked at me like she wasn't sure she'd heard right. "At your house?" "Yeah." "Why aren't you afraid I'll steal everything and cut your throat while you sleep? I don't own much worth stealing. And if you wanted to cut my throat, you could have done it the second I turned my back at the market." She laughed then, short, tired, real. and that small, worn-out laugh told me I was already in too deep. I wouldn't be going back to my empty house alone tonight. I led Lyra back to my house as the last light bled out of the sky. She walked a step behind me the whole way, quiet and watchful like a stray cat that had learned every alley could hide a trap. When we reached the small yard beside the forge, she stopped at the threshold and scanned everything, the hanging hammers, the tongs, the water barrel, the bellows, measuring each object as if deciding whether it could be turned into a weapon if things went wrong. I pushed the door open and stepped inside first so she wouldn't feel cornered. "Sit," I said, nodding toward the room. She didn't take the chair. She chose the upturned wooden crate nearest the door, the one that let her keep both the hearth and the exit in sight. I didn't comment. Some people carry their caution like armor. You don't strip it off them just because they're under your roof. I stirred the fire back to life, hung the small iron pot over the flames, and poured in the last of the dried beans I'd soaked that morning. While the soup heated, I cut the final scrap of smoked meat I'd been saving and dropped it into her bowl before filling my own. She noticed but said nothing. She simply took the spoon and ate slowly the way someone eats when they've gone too many days pretending hunger doesn't exist. Still on the third spoonful, her hand trembled just once, almost invisible. "You eaten anything since morning?" I asked. "A little corn porridge, which means nothing worth counting. You ask a lot of questions. I talk when I eat. Keeps the forge from sounding too loud. I prefer the sound of the forge. Then you're in the wrong house." The corner of her mouth lifted again, the same half-smile she'd almost let out earlier. This time it stayed a fraction longer. Up close in the firelight, I saw she wasn't fragile the way the crowd had wanted to believe. She was just someone who had been forced to fold every sharp edge inward so the world wouldn't cut itself on her. When we finished, she stood without being asked and carried both bowls to the wash basin. I let her. People who've been made to feel like a burden will fight you if you try to take even the smallest task away from them. As she rolled up her sleeves to scrub the bowls, the fire caught the inside of her left wrist. A faded tattoo showed their dark, green-black ink, a crescent moon sliced through by 3 curving lines. Not some cheap market mark. It was the old sigil of House Valek. "I know that mark," I said quietly. Her hands froze mid-motion, water dripping from her fingers, where she asked, voice suddenly flat. "2 years back, I shod horses for one of their supply wagons. Their crates carried the same design." She set the bowl down with deliberate care, as if it might break if she moved too fast. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she turned, eyes guarded, but tired. "So you know the smartest thing right now would be to stop asking questions." I should have. But we had already passed the point where pretending ignorance helped either of us. "You're not the kind of woman who gets accused of stealing soap in the middle of the market," I said. "The way you speak, the way you hold a spoon, the way you never let your back face an open door, that mark on your wrist. Everything says you once belonged to a great house." Lyra stared at me across the small room. The fire made her face sharper, sadder. Once she said at last, "Not anymore." I waited. The wind outside pushed against the shutters. Finally, she spoke again, voice low, and even like she was reciting something she had repeated to herself many nights. "I was the youngest daughter of a lesser branch of House Valek. We grew rich moving grain, salt, and iron along the southern trade roads. My father died of black fever 2 years ago. After that, my stepmother and older brothers took everything, the warehouses, the wagons, the contracts. I wasn't strong enough to fight them openly, but I knew the real ledgers. I knew which seals were forged, which merchants were cheated, which human lords were paid to look the other way. So they stripped me of every ally, spread the story that I had stolen from the family vaults, and made sure no door in the south would open for me again." She gave a small, bitter breath. "They didn't kill me. Dead daughters become legends. Disappeared daughters are simply forgotten." I didn't interrupt. I just listened while she told me how she had run north with nothing but the clothes on her back and the copied proof hidden under her cloak. How she had chosen Raven Mill because it was small and far enough that House Valek's reach might not stretch. How poverty had turned her from a threat into easy prey. When she finished, the only sound was the soft crackle of the fire and the wind worrying the roof. I stood, walked to the door, and slid the heavy wooden bar into place with a solid thunk. "No one drags you out of this house," I said. Lyra looked at me like I had spoken in a language she half believed but had stopped trusting long ago. You don't know what House Valak is capable of. Maybe not. But I know what it feels like to watch a crowd push someone down and then turn away because it's easier. I don't like that feeling. Silence stretched between us again. Then Lyra lowered her eyes to her hands resting in her lap. You always stand up for strangers, no, only when I can't stand watching anymore. She gave the smallest nod. After a long pause, she spoke so quietly I almost missed it. Then, thank you. It was the first time she had thanked me. And in that moment, standing in my tiny house with the smell of bean soup still in the air and an orc woman who carried the weight of a fallen house on her shoulders, I understood something simple and terrifying. I wasn't just giving her shelter for one night. I was already hoping she would stay. 2 weeks slipped by in a rhythm I hadn't known I was missing. Lyra still slept on the narrow cot I'd dragged out from the storage loft, but the house no longer felt like mine alone. Mornings she rose before the sun and helped me pump the bellows while I heated the forge. Evenings she sat at the small table mending her cloak with careful stitches while I sharpened blades by lamplight. We didn't talk much about House Valak. Some things are safer left to cool like iron before you touch them again. But silence doesn't stop the world from moving. I was shaping a new hinge when the sound of heavy hooves rolled into the yard. I looked up through the open doors and saw it a black carriage with curtains drawn tight, pulled by 4 matched grays. 2 servants in dark livery stepped down first. Then the third figure emerged, a tall, orc mail cloak trimmed in silver, a heavy signet ring glinting on his left hand. The Valak crest. Lyra was in the yard washing nails in a bucket of vinegar. The moment she heard the horses, she froze water dripping from her fingers. Her shoulders locked the way they had that first day in the market. The bucket trembled once before she set it down. The orc in the silver-trimmed cloak walked forward until he stood 10 paces from the forge door. His voice was calm, almost bored. Lyra Valak. You have embarrassed the family long enough. Get in the carriage. I stepped out of the forge, wiping my hands on my leather apron. Lyra moved at the same time, coming to stand at my shoulder. Not behind me. Beside me. There's no one here by that name, I said. The orc looked me over like I was a piece of bent scrap. You're the blacksmith who enjoys meddling in matters that don't concern him. I'm the owner of the yard you're standing in. He ignored me and spoke directly to Lyra. Come quietly, or I will make sure the town guard learns you fled with the family ledgers and forged seals. The charge is theft from House Valak. You know what the penalty is. Lyra gave a short, bitter laugh that had no warmth in it. You're still using that same tired lie I thought after all this time House Valak would have invented something less pathetic. I glanced between them. I didn't understand every detail of their blood and money, but I understood enough to know this wasn't just family pride. This was coin. This was power. This was the kind of thing that made men sharpen knives in the dark. The orc reached inside his cloak and produced a rolled parchment. Signed testimony. Missing transport records. Secondary seals taken from the family vault. Everything needed to prove you stole from your own blood. Lyra set the bucket down with deliberate care. Her voice stayed steady. I didn't steal anything. I took copies that show exactly who forged those seals and who sold grain meant for the crown at half price to private buyers. The real thieves are still sitting in Valak Hall. The orc's face tightened just for a heartbeat, but I saw it. So did Lyra. I moved forward until I stood between her and the carriage. If you want to take her, I said, you'll do it right here in front of me, in my yard, in broad daylight, and you'll explain to the whole town why a great house needs 3 armed men to drag one woman away from a blacksmith's shed. The 2 servants behind him rested their hands on the hilts of their short blades. The forge fire crackled louder behind me as if the iron itself was listening. I had no armor, no title, no army, just the hammer still warm in my fist and the woman who had chosen to stand at my side instead of running. Lyra spoke again, softer this time, but every word carried. I'm not running anymore. If they want me, they can try. But they'll have to do it while he's watching. The silver-cloaked orc studied us both for a long moment. He weighed the risk. The public yard, the open street, the fact that half the town could see a Valak carriage parked in front of a common blacksmith's forge. Whatever calculation he made, the numbers didn't favor him today. He rolled the parchment and tucked it away. "This isn't over, blacksmith. When I return, you will have no forge left to hide behind. I'll still be standing here," I answered. He turned without another word. The servants followed. The carriage rolled out of the yard wheels, grinding over the stones like teeth. When the sound of hooves faded, the yard felt suddenly too quiet. I realized my hand was still locked around the hammer so tightly my knuckles ached. Lyra stood beside me, breathing slow and deliberate, as if she had to remind her lungs how to work. "You didn't have to do that," she said at last. "I know. They won't forget you now. I know that too." She turned to face me fully. The guarded look she had worn since the day we met was gone. In its place was something raw and certain. "I've spent 2 years believing that trusting anyone would only get me sold again," she said. Today was the first time I stood still and let someone stand with me instead of in front of me. I set the hammer down on the anvil. The metal rang once soft and final. "Then stop standing behind me," I told her. "Stand beside me." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded one small, decisive motion. From that moment, the house stopped being a place where she was hiding. It started becoming the place where we both chose to stay. The days after the carriage left were quieter than I expected, but the quiet carried weight. We didn't wait for House Valek to strike again. The very next morning, Lyra brought out the small wooden chest she had kept hidden beneath the floorboards since the first night she stayed. Inside were the copied ledgers, the cracked secondary seals, and the careful notes she had made of every falsified shipment. We carried the chest to the town guardhouse together. The captain read the pages in silence, his face growing tighter with every line. By the time he reached the final entry, the man from Valek who had come to my yard was already being summoned. He arrived blustering threats, but the broken seal on the parchment spoke louder than any title. House Valek withdrew from Ravenmill before the week was out. They sent no more carriages. They sent no more men. The shadow simply lifted. The market looked at us differently after that. The same people who had circled Lyra like crows now nodded when we passed. Some even offered cautious greetings. No one called her thief anymore. The following morning I took a fresh plank of seasoned oak from the back of the forge. Lyra sat on the step with a piece of charcoal in her hand and drew the letters slowly, carefully, as if each one mattered more than the last. When she finished, I chiseled them deep so the wind and rain would never erase them. Together, we lifted the new sign and hung it above the forge door. Holt and Lyra Blacksmith. Repairs. Horseshoes. I stepped back and stared at our names side by side. The wood still smelled of fresh cut and fire. My chest felt too full and too light at the same time. "You didn't have to put your name on it," I said. "I wanted to," she answered simply. "If I stay as myself. No more hiding." That night, the first spring rain fell soft against the roof. We sat under the wide eaves of the forge, shoulder to shoulder, watching the water run off the new sign. Lyra turned to me. Without a word, she leaned forward until her forehead rested against mine. No kiss, not yet. Just the quiet press of skin and breath and choice. Her hair smelled of smoke and rain. Her hands found mine in the dark and held on. "I used to think the only way to survive was to disappear," she whispered. "Now I want to be seen, right here, with you." I closed my eyes and felt every hammer strike of the last few weeks settle into something solid and warm. "You are seen," I said, "every day, every morning when you pump the bellows, every evening when you sit at my table. You're not the orc they tried to shame in the market anymore. And I'm not the man who lived alone with nothing but iron and silence." The rain kept falling gentle and steady, washing the last traces of fear from the yard. Inside the forge, the coals still glowed low and red, keeping watch through the night. Above us, the new sign creaked once in the wind, as if agreeing with everything we had chosen. Lyra was no longer the woman forced to her knees in front of strangers. I was no longer the blacksmith who came home to an empty house. We had a forge that belonged to both of us, a roof that no longer felt temporary, and a life we had decided to build together, one nail, one meal, one quiet night at a time. And for the first time in years, that was more than enough.